Okay, let's move on to Vindhya and then hopefully catch up with that one with the questions. Considering the constant flow of images and increasingly easy access to cameras by virtue of cell phones, we were interested to find out Vindhya's view on the powers and the possibilities of net-lit photography and how far it can be seen as a democratic use of the medium. Your research looks at how net-lit photography is used by the Tamil community in Sri Lanka to narrate experience of conflict and represent political identity. Can you tell us more about how this functions in a specific instance?
Okay. Thank you for having me and thank you for being here. So when I looked at kind of the topic of photography and democracy, I looked at it in terms of the democratization of the medium as an access to the medium, which within a context like Sri Lanka is actually quite recent in the sense that Sri Lanka had a closed market up until the 1970s, which meant that access to cameras was very limited. And then obviously, things picked up, market opened up, people were going abroad, they'd come back with cameras, but still it kind of remained in the hands of, people who had money. But then with cell phones, that rapidly changed. And this is also all happening within the context of a conflict or civil war in the case of Sri Lanka, which went from 83 to 2009. I'm not going to get into it, it's incredibly complicated, but if you have any questions, please ask. But basically, the gist of it is that stemming out of kind of systemic discrimination against the Sri Lankan Tamil community, there was a kind of self-styled group that claimed to speak on behalf of the kind of Tamil minority of the country and wanted a separate state. So this was kind of the reason for the war, and this went on from 1983 to 2009, and the war ended in 2009 with a kind of an outright military victory by the state, where thousands and thousands of civilians died. And a lot of the root causes that led to the war to begin with remain unaddressed even today. And one of the kind of specific things that I've been looking at, so my work looks at kind of photography representation in the Sri Lankan Tamil community within this kind of post-war context, where in relation to the war, the community has been kind of largely represented either as victims or as militants, because again, the kinds of photographs that were coming out of Sri Lanka from the kind of 1980s onwards were photographs taken by either the state, photojournalists, or, not so much in the everyday because there wasn't much access to cameras. But kind of after that, how is now the community, with all of these kind of unresolved political issues, trying to kind of represent itself in a way? And this is kind of where my question came out of. And my research is also part of a wider project that looks at the political potentials of photography that's funded by the ERC based out of UCL, looking at photography and its political potentials in a number of other places. But anyway, getting back to the point, one of the kind of specific uses of photographs as material objects and then photography in terms of activism and photojournalism that I've been looking at in Sri Lanka is to do with the protests of the family members of the disappeared. So Sri Lanka has the second highest number of enforced disappearances in the world. This has a very long history going back to the early 70s, but the most kind of recent kind of string of protests and demands come from the disappearances that took place in the final phases of the war, so 2005 to 2009, and also after the war ended because of various issues to do with terrorism suspects, things like that, and so on, but also people who were simply rounded up at the end of the war and put into detention centers and then kind of disappeared without a trace. So Sri Lanka had a quite repressive government during this period, and then we had a change in government in 2015, which kind of created spaces for people to protest, people to ask for answers, and there was a shift-ish. And these protests by the families of the disappeared in the north and east started in 2016, and these protests were really interesting because of their use of photographs as very kind of material objects within the context of the protest. So they happened in 5 locations in the north and east, and my work looks at kind of 2 protest sites in particular. I'm not going to go into details about that, but these are kind of sites that are set up on the side of the road, kind of temporary transient shacks, and if you look at them, they're incredibly striking because they're adorned completely with, photographs of like family members who've disappeared by the protesters. So these are everything from kids' birthday photos to family photos to holiday photos to national identity card and passport pictures, or like pages from these documents that have been photocopied and scanned and put up, which I think is really interesting, talking about the relationship to the state, for example, and surveillance and so on. So these protests started and they've been going on for over 500 days now. The format of the protests have changed slightly, but these protests are also interesting because they kind of, I guess, connect to a kind of wider global aesthetic of protest to do with disappearances protests, as we've seen in places like Argentina, for example. And within the Sri Lankan context, it's interesting because of the way in which these protesters and their photographs, also the way they have been photographed in turn, because these images, particularly of protesting mothers and family members, have become almost again a trope of kind of post-war issues in Sri Lanka. You look at any newspaper article in the international press about Sri Lanka, it has a picture of, you know, a protesting family member with this kind of quite an evocative image of you know, somebody holding up, you know, a picture of their child, or so on and so forth. And this is interesting because of a number of reasons. So obviously here we have photography, which has often been seen as a tool of the state, being turned back at the state to demand answers. And in case anyone's not aware, the state is responsible for a lot of these disappearances, because a lot of the family members who are protesting right now in the north and the east are family members of people who were kind of detained by the army in 2009 and then kind of vanished without a trace. And this is also interesting in the context of, say, the use of identity document photographs, passport pictures, national identity card pictures, which are documents of the state, being turned back at the state as kind of proof of existence, where the state is unwilling to take any kind of responsibility for these kind of mass disappearances that happened. But in terms of the kind of aesthetics of these, are also incredibly evocative images that have kind of drawn attention to Sri Lanka in a way, in terms of these protests have been reported about mostly in the international press more than the local press, but that's a different story. And I think that's been really interesting because, again, the way in which people find the most kind of like, you know, awful. So for example, some months ago I was at one of the protest sites and there was a little girl who was there with her family. It was the 365th day of that protest, so they were having a little bit of a kind of a special sit-in that day. And there was a little girl with a photograph of her father and a little sign that said, "Where's my father? Press love this," right? So they essentially brought this child up, put her in the middle, and just like, it was an assembly line of photographers who were just kind of photographing this child. And within the context of this, it's just like, this is quite horrible, but, you know, is this going to get these protesters visibility? What does that mean in terms of the outcomes of the protest? There are lots of questions about that. But one of the other interesting things about this protest is also, majority of these protesters are Tamil language speakers. There's a lot of tension with relation to language in Sri Lanka because of the state, again, which is a Sinhalese speaking state, and where people have been often kind of entrapped by language of bureaucracy and otherwise. Photographs have allowed them a way to kind of communicate something that they otherwise may not be able to communicate as effectively because of, you know, all of the kind of sentiments that these images evoke. So there's another side to this in terms of, until 2015, memorialization and commemoration of May the 18th, which was the kind of official day the war ended, was banned because the government didn't want the kind of, you know, the LTT and so on to be kind of glorified in any way, and because certain family members could have been militants, they kind of clamped down on it, and that space only opened up 2015. And one of the kind of interesting things about these protest sites is they've also kind of become kind of transient sites of memorialization in a space where memorialization is otherwise quite heavily policed. And these protest sites themselves are policed. So this is also the other side of photography, which you were talking about, because there's a lot of intelligence. Anytime you go to the protest sites, you get photographed by intelligence kind of officials, things like that. The family members are harassed constantly and things like that. So there is this kind of contention there, but I think it's created an interesting space for people to communicate something that they might otherwise not be able to communicate because of challenges in language or literacy or what have you. And I guess that's why these kind of sites of resistance using photographs and photography of has been kind of interesting. And I mean, in a sense, maybe says something slightly positive about the kind of democratic potential of it. Very slightly, maybe, at least. I mean, it's great to think that this might help them in terms of visibility in some way, even though there is this kind of exploitation around it, the media photography, those kinds of things. But, you know, if it helps protesters communicate something effectively, and they have been doing this now for a while with little kind of forward movement, but that's a different story. Fingers crossed it will get somewhere. So I'm going to end on that, but I guess we were supposed to end with a question.
If you have one.
Not really. I think going back to what you said about democracy as well, and again looking at the Sri Lanka example of majorities and minorities, and now this kind of conversation about populism and so on, what does that mean for photography? Because as much as we see photography as empowering, being able to make a difference, kind of work that you do, for example, what about the bad stuff? Because there's a lot of photography and photographs and images, edited images that are also circulating that are inciting hate, calling for violence. We see this across Southeast Asia with anti-Muslim sentiment, for example, in Burma, in Sri Lanka, in India, and so on. And these are also photographic images which are being kind of, circulated to incite violence and, various other things. So I guess that's another question in terms of what democratizing means in that sense. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Anyone? Any
I have a question.
Yeah.
In direct relation to the
question? Yeah.
to the period of time that you were talking about back in 2009. Do you think that if the technology that is available now had been available then, that might have had a significant difference on what happened in 2009, specifically the first few months of 2009?
Well, it's really interesting because there was a lot of photography that was generated in that period. Obviously, technology wasn't as sophisticated as it is now. Like, social media wasn't exactly in use in the same way that it was now and so on. But one of the questions about war crimes, things like that, and there has been kind of things that have happened, but then there's also been the kind of counter movement to that, being like, this was doctored, this was not doctored, and the kind of conversation around that, and the way in which the state then in turn appropriated those images to kind of locally in Sri Lanka to kind of say, look, we're being victimized by the West, and it's kind of your patriotic duty to kind of stand by your government. That kind of rhetoric also came out of it. So it's had a really interesting kind of effect in terms of how these photographs have been used, and I think that just kind of goes on to say that there is, I guess, a bit of ambivalence in terms of how even a horrible photograph that might serve as evidence of one thing can also be used in a completely different way, in a completely opposite way or contradictory way. But I don't know, I mean, with the photographs that they had, not much has, I mean, it's been important in terms of awareness, but there hasn't really been any consequences, like actual consequences. So
yeah, I mean, I deliberately sort of like put that question to you because we talked already a lot about technology and how much technology has changed in the last decade, and yet over the last year we've seen exactly the same thing pretty much happen in Myanmar.
Exactly.
Where there may still be a population that didn't have the same access to technology that we are kind of making some broad assumptions that everybody has access to this technology, and that isn't the case. And yet, the same thing happened 10 years ago, and there was, a lot of debate about the veracity of those images, few as they were. So in some ways we haven't moved forward. We talk about fake news now because Trump coined the phrase effectively, but there's nothing new in that. So I don't, I'm not sure where I'm going with that, but I just wanted to sort of raise the point that actually this happened 10 years ago, and it's happening again now. So how do we move beyond that so that it doesn't happen again? And what role does technology, what role can technology and photography potentially play in preventing atrocities like that in the future?
Also in terms of, I think, international mechanisms, they don't really count as evidence, or they don't conform to what might qualify as evidence for any actual action to happen. I mean, it's useful, but
I mean, that's a whole other sort of the subject of photographic record, photographic evidence of these things happening.
Exactly.
is really vital to anybody being held to account for them. So that kind of debate about the veracity of those images then, now, and ever is so important. And the preservation of those images and there's massive implications for that conversation, for that sort of subject.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know an organisation that helps communities on the front line of climate change. They're called the Environmental Justice Foundation, but they go and teach people on the front line how to use technology so that they can document what's happening to their communities in order to fight against these huge corporations that are just destroying their land or whatever, illegal fishing and all sorts of things like that. So in a way, they're being given the tools to kind of stake I don't know if it's a democratic claim, but a claim to a voice and a different opinion to what's happening and to also make that public. And I don't know if in those kind of horrific war situations that happens, whether there are people who are helping these communities to voice against, to talk about the atrocities that are happening. But photography can always be used to help people, but it equally can be used to suppress them and pillage.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the flip side to this is also, I mean, the way in which I work with photography, there are lots of different sides to it. This is one kind of particular aspect of it. For example, there are lots of, say, young people who've kind of grown up in this period who are now using things like Instagram because they're kind of tired of the kind of image of war and they're using this as kind of a form of citizen journalism, so to speak, where they kind of want to tell local stories from their communities and things like that. And this is really nice and reassuring to see, because it is as much about, say, talking about this is how beautiful my village is, to, this is how I live side by side with the military because this is how militarized my hometown is and things like that. So I think it's interesting because it is giving a space for people to kind of like talk about this stuff. But then I think the interesting thing again is then about the democratization of the medium, how many people actually have access to it. There's obviously the big issue of language, right? How much of technology exists in English, and what that means for people who don't speak any English or are not able to navigate technology in English. So I mean, there's that side of it as well. So I mean, within this there are all these layers of like privilege and so on and so forth that you need to account for. But I mean, obviously nothing's perfect. So.